The biting wind of the European autumn whistled through the gray buildings of the suburbs, carrying with it the scent of impending rain and wet earth. For Aisha, each gust was a reminder of the winters in Kabul, but without the warmth of the kursi shared with her family, now reduced to dust and memory. Her feet, shod in thin shoes worn by the endless walk as a refugee, ached with every step on the way back from her cleaning job. The exhaustion was a physical entity, a leaden weight on her bones, but it was overshadowed by the persistent emptiness in her stomach. She counted the meager coins in her palm, her skin rough and cracked from chlorine and cleaning products. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. It barely covered the rent for the tiny moldy room she shared with her little girl, Lena, 5 years old. The girl was a beacon of light in Aisha's darkness, with her brown eyes inherited from her father, a good man who didn't live to see his daughter grow up far from the war. Aisha entered the small neighborhood grocery store, the doorbell ringing like a funeral dirge. The air was thick with the sweet smell of fresh bread, a luxury she couldn't afford. Her eyes scanned the shelves, calculating, always calculating. A package of pasta, the cheapest brand. A can of tomatoes. A liter of long-life milk for Lena. That was it. The monthly grocery shopping. She approached the counter, where Mr. Dmitri, the owner, a man with a gray mustache and a perpetually frowning expression, watched her every move with suspicion. Aisha avoided his gaze. She knew what he saw. A foreigner, a refugee, a woman alone. A burden. She placed the items on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. The price appeared on the digital display. Aisha's heart froze. It was more expensive than usual. She recounted the coins, once more, knowing she was a few cents short. "Sir!" Her voice came out as a whisper, rough with disuse and shame. "The price has gone up?" Dmitri snorted impatiently. "Inflation, my dear. Everything goes up. Even dignity." He spoke in the local language and Aisha, with her basic knowledge, understood the essence, not the exact words. Her face burned. She began to take the can of tomatoes, sacrificing the sauce to have milk for her daughter, when a calm, firm voice sounded behind her. "Leave it. I'll cover the difference." Aisha turned, surprised. A man, perhaps in his 40s, with a simple but clean coat, and the kindest eyes she had seen since leaving her country, held a banknote. He wasn't from the neighborhood. She would have noticed. He smiled, a small gesture, but one that didn't fully reach his eyes, which seemed to carry a sadness of their own. "Please," he said, placing the note on the counter before Dmitri or Aisha could protest. Aisha mumbled a thank you in her native tongue, her heart pounding in her chest. Shame and gratitude mingled in a confused emotion. The man merely nodded, picked up his own bread and left, disappearing into the afternoon twilight like a ghost. Aisha picked up her shopping bag, that inexplicable act of kindness warming her cold body. It was the first pang of human warmth she had felt in months. She left the store, head bowed, unaware that, across the street, standing under the awning of a building, the sad-eyed man watched her walk home, his face a mask of silent contemplation. He saw her adjust her faded hijab in the wind, her shoulders hunched under the weight of an indifferent world. And he remained there, motionless, even as the first light rain began to fall, washing the dirty streets but not the pain of that woman. He watched her until she disappeared from sight, turning the corner toward the tenement she called home. Aisha, exhausted, no longer thought about the stranger. Kindness was a rare event, a strange deviation in the cruel narrative of her life. She treasured that moment as one treasures a precious jewel, a tiny glimmer of color in a black and white world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations. But for that night, the milk was warm in Lena's stomach, and the girl smiled as she drank. For Aisha, that was all that mattered. The rest was shadow. The rain was now falling with determination, beating against the single window of Aisha's room with an insistent and depressing rhythm. The place smelled of mold, peeling paint, and resigned despair. But in the center of that small universe of deprivation, sitting on the narrow bed they shared, Lena was drawing with a broken crayon, her concentrated tongue pressed between her lips. "Mom, look. It's you and me under a big sun." Aisha forced a smile, a gesture that required a Herculean effort. The drawing was crude, the sun looked more like a yellow stain, but the love it represented was the only thing keeping Aisha sane. The kindness of the stranger in the shop echoed in her mind, a small miracle that prevented her from crying in front of her daughter. But gratitude was an ephemeral luxury. Reality, cruel and sharp, knocked on the door earlier the next morning. It was the landlord, a man with brusque manners and miserly eyes. "Late again, Aisha," he said without any preamble, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "3 more days and you and the little one will be on the street. I'm not a charity." The door slammed shut, leaving behind silence and the bitter taste of humiliation. Aisha pressed her forehead against the cold door, feeling tears burn her eyes. She didn't let them fall. Crying was a concession the world didn't deserve. The job at the cleaning company was a daily sentence. Scrubbing, cleaning, polishing. The gleaming bathrooms of the upscale offices were a silent insult to her own dirty, weary existence. Her co-workers, other women from distant countries, spoke in whispers, sharing stories of sick children and absent husbands. Aisha didn't share. Her pain was her only true possession. That night, on her way home in a light, persistent rain, she passed Mr. Dimitri's corner store again. And that's when she saw him. The same man from the day before. He stood under the awning of a closed cafe, leaning against the wall, his hands in his coat pockets. He didn't greet her. He didn't make any sign. He just watched her, his gentle yet penetrating eyes following her tired every move. A chill ran down Aisha's spine. Fear? No, it was something different. It was the strange feeling of being seen. After so long trying to be invisible, a pair of eyes were watching her with disconcerting intensity. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. Why was he there? What did he want? Her mind, conditioned by distrust and trauma, began to weave dark scenarios. Perhaps kindness had a price. Perhaps he was like the other men, seeing in her a vulnerable, lonely woman. She arrived home, locked the door, and slipped off the chain, breathless. Lena was asleep, her serene face a stark contrast to Aisha's inner turmoil. In the days that followed, the man became a constant presence, a fixed point in the shifting landscape of her routine. He never approached, never tried to speak. He was at the bus stop when she went to work, sitting on a distant park bench when she took Lena to play for half an hour, always at a distance, always watching. Aisha began to change her route, to avoid certain streets. Fear settled in, a poisonous seed planted by the initial act of kindness. She felt like a cornered animal, her every move being monitored. The kindness, she concluded bitterly, was just the bait. The trap would come later. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting journey where she had been reprimanded for not cleaning a corner properly, Aisha got off the bus wanting to dissolve onto the sidewalk. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cold and damp. And there he was, in the same place, under the same awning. Something inside Aisha snapped. Fear gave way to a dull, seething rage. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't bear the hunger, the exhaustion, the humiliation, and now, this silent surveillance. She crossed the street resolutely, her footsteps echoing in the late afternoon silence. He didn't move as she approached, his eyes still gentle, but now carrying a weight she couldn't decipher. "What do you want from me?" Aisha's voice came out as a low growl, laden with years of frustration. "Why do you follow me? I have nothing. Nothing. You've seen where I live. You've seen my life. Leave me alone." Tears finally broke through the barrier, streaming hot and salty down her weary face. The man looked at her, his own expression not shifting to defensiveness or anger. There was only a deep, overwhelming sadness. He opened his mouth to speak, but Aisha had already turned and fled, her body trembling with emotion and shame. She ran home, to the precarious safety of her 4 walls, certain that now, finally, he would give up. He had seen the cornered beast, and no man would want to deal with that. She was wrong. The confrontation didn't bring the relief Aisha had hoped for. On the contrary, a sharp anxiety gripped her. Every sound on the building's stairwell made her heart race. Every figure on the street was a potential threat. She avoided Mr. Dimitri's corner store, preferring to walk 40 minutes to a cheaper, but more distant warehouse. Life, already difficult, had become a nightmare of constant vigilance, only now the sentinel was her own fear. Lena, perceptive as children usually are, asked, "Mommy, are you angry?" Aisha hugged her daughter with sudden strength, whispering promises of safety in her native tongue that she herself didn't believe. 3 days passed. The man disappeared. No sign of him at the bus stop, on the park bench, under the awning. Aisha felt a pang of something resembling disappointment? Perhaps that constant presence, however frightening, was better than the absolute emptiness of the world's indifference. She was going crazy, she decided. Deprivation was clouding her judgment. Then winter showed its claws. A cold front descended upon the city, bringing with it a biting wind and the first snow of the year. Pure white flakes danced in the air, covering the dirt and gray of the streets with a deceptively clean blanket. For Aisha, the snow was just another enemy. It meant wet clothes, leaky shoes, and the prohibitive cost of heating she couldn't afford. That night on her way home, the wind howled like a tormented soul. Aisha clutched her thin coat to her body, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Lena had a fever, and Aisha had spent her last coins on a cheap remedy that barely had any effect. Despair was a ball of ice in her chest, colder than the snow accumulating on her shoulders. She rushed past the closed cafe, its awning now empty, and an irrational part of her wished the man were there. At least her eyes would have recognized her as a human being, and not just a trembling ghost in the storm. That's when she saw him. Not under the awning, but sitting on the steps of her building's entrance, huddled against the cold, covered in a thin layer of snow, as if he had been there for hours. He held a small cardboard box, protecting it under his coat. Seeing her, he stood slowly, snow falling from his shoulders. Aisha's fear resurfaced, but it was overshadowed by utter exhaustion. She was too tired to be afraid. "Please," she pleaded, her voice a whisper on the wind. "I have nothing to give you. Leave us alone." The man didn't move. Instead, he held out the box. "This is for Lena," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Please. It's important." Aisha looked at the box, then at the man's face. His eyes no longer seemed merely sad. They seemed anxious, desperate for something. The snow continued to fall, covering them in a surreal silence. And then, something inside the box emitted a low sound. A meow. Faint, but unmistakable. Aisha froze. The man carefully placed the box on the ground at her feet. 10 years ago, he began, his voice trembling not only from the cold. "I lost my family. My wife. My daughter. They were the same age as Lena. An attack. A bomb. In Kabul." The words hit Aisha like physical blows. Kabul. The word echoed in her mind, bringing with it a whirlwind of memories. The deafening noise, the smell of smoke and gunpowder, the terrifying silence that followed. She looked at the man, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. The sadness in his eyes wasn't generic. It was a specific pain, sculpted by the same furnace that had molded hers. "I was an interpreter," he continued, his eyes fixed on her, pleading for her to understand. "I worked with the coalition forces. When it all happened, I wasn't there. I was on a mission. And when I returned..." His voice faltered. He swallowed hard. There was nothing to return to. Aisha felt her legs go weak. She remembered. Not him specifically, but those days. The chaos. The collective pain. The despair. Why do you follow me?" she asked, her voice now a whisper. The man pointed to the box. "Open it." With trembling hands, Aisha knelt in the snow and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a kitten, small and white, with a black patch around one eye. It meowed again, its blue eyes fixed on her. And then Aisha saw. Tied delicately around the kitten's neck with a red ribbon, was a small silver pendant. A pendant she instantly recognized. It was a hamsa, the hand of Fatima. A protective amulet. The same pendant she had given, in an act of impulsive compassion, to a small, frightened girl in a refugee camp in Greece years ago. The girl was alone, crying, separated from her family. Aisha, herself with nothing, took the only valuable object she possessed, the pendant her own mother had given her, and placed it in the child's hand. "This will protect you," she whispered that day, in a rare moment of human connection amidst the chaos. She had never thought about it again. It was a forgotten gesture, buried under layers of new pain. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The girl," she choked out. "The girl in the camp was your daughter." The man shook his head, tears finally breaking and streaming down his frozen face. "No. It was my brother's daughter. My niece. You saved her life that day. You calmed her panic. She treasured that pendant. She didn't survive the trip to Europe. She fell ill. But before she left, she told me about the big-hearted woman, the Afghan woman who gave her her own protection. She described her. Her eyes. The scar above her eyebrow. She said your name was Aisha." The snow seemed to stop falling. The whole world disappeared. Only the two of them existed on the staircase, united by a shared tragedy and a long-forgotten act of kindness. "I searched for her for years," he whispered. "Everywhere. And then, a month ago I saw her. Coming out of this building. I couldn't believe it. I needed to be sure. I needed to protect her from afar without frightening her. Until today." He pointed to the kitten. "My niece loved cats. She would have adored this one. And Lena, every child deserves a friend to warm their heart." Aisha couldn't breathe. She wasn't invisible. She never had been. Her existence, her small act of kindness, had echoed through time and across the ocean, bringing her a guardian she didn't even know she had. She looked at the pendant, then at the face of the man, whose name she didn't even know, and saw in him not a pursuer, but a kindred spirit in pain. A beacon in her darkness. She reached out, not to take the box, but to touch his hand, cold and trembling. And in that touch, in the midst of the blizzard, under the dim light of a street lamp, Aisha felt something she had long thought had died forever. A fragile, tender sprout of hope. The little kitten, which Lena had named Baron, Rain in Dari, purred like a tiny motor against the girl's chest, dissipating the fever with the pure warmth of a new joy. Aisha watched from the bedroom doorway, the cup of warm tea in her hands. Tea that Kale, the man with the sad eyes, had insisted on preparing for her in the small kitchen, her movements cautious and respectful. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear, but with a shared reverence for a revelation so monumental that it altered the very gravity of the room. Kale told his story sitting on the only bench, his voice a low, steady narrative against the whistling wind outside. He spoke of his work as an interpreter, of the overwhelming guilt of the survivor, of the obsessive search that consumed him for years, following cold leads through refugee camps and immigration offices. "Finding her became my only reason," he confessed, looking at his hands. "It was the last promise I had to make to my niece." Aisha listened, each word echoing in her own scars. She offered no empty words of consolation. What consolation could there be for such a loss? Instead, she shared her own silence, a tribute to his pain. When he rose to leave, near midnight, a strange reluctance hung in the air. "Tomorrow," he said, standing in the doorway, "if you'll allow me, I'd like to help. Lena needs a doctor for this fever. And I know someone." Aisha felt the old instinct, the paranoid whisper that warned her of pitfalls and debts. But her eyes met his, and she saw only the raw truth of his story. She nodded, a small, decisive movement. "All right." The next morning, Kale was there, punctual. He didn't try to enter, waiting outside the building. The snow had stopped, leaving a clean, white blanket over the city. On her way to the community clinic Kale knew, Aisha noticed how people greeted him. The baker nodded, an elderly lady smiled. He was part of that social fabric, a familiar and apparently respected figure. The doctor, a kind and weary man, treated Lena free of charge, a favor to Kale, who sometimes did translation work for the clinic. It was the first time in years that Aisha hadn't had to beg or humiliate herself for medical assistance for her daughter. While Lena slept soundly at home, exhausted by the fever that was finally breaking, Kale appeared with shopping bags. They weren't luxuries but essential, quality items: rice, lentils, fruit, fresh vegetables, a suitable winter coat for Lena, and a pair of sturdy boots for Aisha. "It's not charity," he said, anticipating her refusal, his face serious. It's an investment. You can't take care of anyone if you're staggering from hunger and cold. Think of Lena. The mention of her daughter disarmed Aisha. She accepted the groceries, shame slowly being replaced by a sense of relief so profound it made her tremble. That night, she cooked a complete and nutritious meal for the first time in months. The taste of real food, not just to fill the stomach but to nourish, was a revelation. While Lena ate with an appetite she hadn't seen in a long time, Aisha allowed herself to feel, for the first time, that perhaps kindness could indeed exist without a hidden ulterior motive. Perhaps some bridges were built only to be crossed, not for someone to fall off them. Kale became a discreet but constant presence. He fixed the jammed window in the room, stopped the draft. He brought children's books in Dari for Lena, reading to her with infinite patience. Aisha watched the interaction, her heart aching in a new way. It wasn't jealousy, but a painful recognition that Lena needed that, a kind and stable male figure. Gradually, Kale's vigilance transformed into protection. Aisha no longer felt observed, she felt cared for. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling, like an atrophied muscle being used after years of inactivity. She was learning to trust, and each small act of Kale's, a silent repair, a book left by the door, a note asking if Lena was feeling better, was a thread weaving a safety net beneath her feet, a net she didn't even know she needed. Trust, Aisha discovered, was like the thaw after a harsh winter. Slow, trickling, revealing the fertile soil hidden beneath the layer of ice. Kale wasn't a long-winded talker, but his actions were eloquent language. He began helping her fill out complicated forms, navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth that had always left her on the brink of despair. One day, he took her to a community center where he volunteered to teach the local language to refugees. "They need an assistant," he said simply. "Someone who understands what they've been through. Someone who speaks their language." The work was modest, but it was within a clean, warm, and most importantly, respectful environment. Aisha, initially shy, found her voice among those who shared their stories of loss and resilience. She saw her own fear reflected in the eyes of the other women, and, for the first time, felt not like a victim, but a survivor. She could help. The simple act of offering a cup of tea to a trembling newcomer, of whispering a word of comfort in her native tongue, made Aisha feel visible in a new and powerful way. As her life gained new purpose, her relationship with Kale deepened into something tacit and profound. They rarely spoke of their past traumas, words were insufficient. Instead, they honored them through small rituals of care. Kale always brought Lena an extra sweet roll on Saturday mornings. Aisha ensured there was always a hot meal for him when he arrived after his day job at a mechanic's shop. They were two islands ravaged by the same storm, finding shelter in each other. One afternoon, sitting on a bench in the empty square, with Lena and Baron chasing pigeons in the distance, Kale broke the comfortable silence. "I can't replace anyone's past," he said, his eyes following Lena with a tenderness that hurt to see. "And I can't erase what we've lost." Aisha looked at him, his solid profile against the autumnal sky. "I know," she whispered. "But you're helping to build a new gift. This is more than I ever dared to hope for." It was then that Kale did something that changed the atmosphere between them. He turned and, with infinite gentleness, moved a strand of hair that the wind had blown to Aisha's face. His fingers lightly touched her temple, a brief contact like the fluttering of a hummingbird's wings, but one that sent a wave of warmth through her body. It wasn't a touch of passion, but of profound intimacy, of a recognition of souls. Aisha's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. That simple gesture was the kindest thing a man had done for her since her husband's death. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply giving. That night, after Kale had left and Lena had fallen asleep with a smile on her lips, Aisha stood before the small mirror in the hallway. She looked at her own reflection. The same tired eyes, the same scar above her eyebrow. But something had changed. The woman looking back at her was no longer the same one who believed no one would notice her. She had been seen. First by a dying child, whose memory had become a torch. Then by a man who carried that torch through the darkness. And now, finally, by herself. She saw a survivor. A protector. A woman who, even with her heart in tatters, had managed to offer a fragment of her own protection to a stranger. Aisha touched the spot on her temple where Kale's fingers had been. The echo of that touch was warm, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. The future, for the first time, did not resemble an abyss, but a path she would not have to walk alone. Baron purred and rubbed against her legs, and Aisha smiled, a genuine, wholehearted smile that reached her eyes. Healing, she realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding someone to remember with in peace. Autumn had plunged into deep winter, and Aisha's life had transformed from a monochromatic nightmare into a picture of soft, yet vibrant colors. Her work at the community center wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. She was the first friendly face many disoriented refugees saw, and her own story was a passport to their confidence. She translated not only words, but also fears and hopes. At home, the tiny room seemed larger, filled with Lena's laughter, Baron's purrs, and the calm presence of Kale, who now dined with them almost every night. He had brought a small oil heater, banishing the biting cold that had previously dominated the space. That night, he brought something different, an envelope. "It's for you," he said to Aisha, his tone serious. Inside were official papers and a letter from the building's tenants association. The landlord, the gruff man, was being sued for poor housing conditions and illegally renting rooms. The building would be inspected and, most likely, he would be forced to make extensive repairs or evict the tenants. "This is good," Kale explained. "It means he can't just throw you out on the street. And if there is an eviction, you'll be entitled to rehousing through the city. There's a lawyer downtown who can help." Aisha held the papers, her hands trembling. It was real, tangible protection against the threat that had hung over her head like a sword for years. She looked at Kale, speechless. How could she thank a man who had not only rescued her from invisibility, but was now fighting to secure his own space? Gratitude overflowed within her, and without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. It was a quick, impulsive gesture, laden with all the emotion that words couldn't convey. Kale's face flushed slightly, and his eyes sparkled with an emotion Aisha dared not decipher. The moment was broken by the ringing of the doorbell. Unusual for that hour. Aisha frowned, and Kale stood, instinctively placing himself between the door and her. When she opened the door, there he was. The landlord. His face was flushed with anger, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Aisha. "So it's you," he growled, his breath heavy with alcohol. "The sly refugee. Putting lawyers and lawsuits under my nose." He completely ignored Kale's presence. "You can pack your things and get lost. You and your little bastard. Out." Aisha froze, the old fear returning in a paralyzing whirlwind. But before she could utter a word, Kale stepped forward, his body completely blocking the entrance. He wasn't a particularly large man, but at that moment, his posture radiated a silent, immobile authority. "She's not going anywhere." Kale's voice was low, flat, and cold as steel. "There are ongoing legal proceedings. If you touch her, or the child, you'll have to deal with me. And with the law." The landlord laughed, a nasty, harsh sound. "And who are you? The immigrant's white knight? Is she bewitching you too? They're all the same, you know." He didn't finish the sentence. Kale took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His face didn't show anger, but an absolute determination that was far more frightening. "Get out. Now." The word hung in the cold hallway. The two men stared at each other, and it was the landlord who backed away first, cursing under his breath. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a fat finger at Aisha before turning and going down the stairs, stumbling slightly. Kale closed the door slowly, locking it. He took a deep breath and turned to Aisha. She was visibly trembling, her arms crossed over her chest. The ghost of eviction, of the street, of utter insecurity, had returned to haunt her with all its force. "He won't do anything," Kale said, his voice returning to its usual softness. "He's a coward. He's just trying to intimidate." Aisha couldn't stop trembling. The scene brought back memories of male voices shouting, of doors being broken down, of a primal fear she thought she had left behind. What if he, What if he comes back? What if he hurts us? She whispered, her voice breaking. Kale looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just promises, but a fundamental truth. He moved closer, not to touch her, but to be near. Aisha, he said, her name escaping his lips like a guarantee. I'm here. From day one, I've been watching over you to protect you. And I'm not going anywhere. No one will hurt you or Lena while I'm here. No one. And for the first time, faced with that real threat, Aisha allowed herself to fully believe. She wasn't alone. She had a guardian. She had a friend. She had Kale. The trembling in her hands gradually subsided. She looked at Lena, who watched the scene from the bedroom doorway with wide eyes, embracing Baron. Aisha straightened her shoulders. She was no longer the woman who cowered before threat. She was a fighter. And now, she wasn't fighting alone. The tension in the small room dissipated like smoke, but a new kind of energy, electric and determined, took its place. Kale didn't leave that night. He sat in the kitchen chair, a silent sentinel, while Aisha rocked Lena to sleep. The girl, still frightened, clung to the Hamsa pendant Kale had given her, an exact replica he had made for her. Is Uncle Kale going to send the bad man away? She whispered, her small voice full of hope. Yes, Jasmine, Aisha whispered back, kissing her forehead. Uncle Kale won't let anyone hurt us. The words, once spoken, solidified into truth within her. In the living room, Kale was on the phone, his voice low but firm, speaking to the community center lawyer, reporting the threat. Aisha watched him, the resolute posture of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed on the tabletop with focus. He was no longer just a guardian. He was an ally, a strategist. He was no longer just protecting them from a distance. He was fighting a battle alongside them. In the days that followed, a transformation took place in Aisha. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it was supplanted by a cold, maternal fury. She wouldn't allow the shadow of that man to ruin the fragile refuge they had built. She and Kale became a team. She meticulously gathered all the evidence of the apartment's conditions. Photographs of the mold, the frayed electrical wiring, the broken window. She encouraged the other families in the building, women like herself, to join the complaint. Kale, with his fluency and knowledge of the system, handled the official communication. It was Aisha, however, with her quiet rediscovered courage, who got the elderly woman on the ground floor, who had feared reprisals for years, to sign the petition. It was she who confronted the landlord in a hallway, not with shouts, but with devastating calm. "We have a lawyer," she said, her voice unwavering. "And we have the law on our side. If you touch us, it will be your ruin." The man was surprised by her audacity, spitting out an insult, but backing down. He no longer saw a victim, he saw an adversary. The legal battle dragged on for weeks, but the tide had turned. The threat of eviction had become an opportunity. The Tenants Association had secured a deal. The landlord would have to temporarily rehouse all the tenants during the renovations or pay compensation so they could find new housing. Kale found a small, clean, two-bedroom apartment with central heating in a quieter neighborhood. The lawyer ensured that Aisha's social assistance would cover most of the rent. Moving day was chaotic, full of boxes and dust, but also laughter. Lena ran through the empty space, delighted with the room, her voice echoing off the bare walls like a hymn to the future. Kale carried the heaviest boxes, his sweat a testament to his investment in this new beginning. When the last box was placed in the new apartment, and the door closed against the world, a silence laden with meaning hung in the air. It was no longer the silence of fear or loneliness, but that of a page turned. Aisha looked around. Her few possessions seemed even more meager in the larger space, but the late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust that danced in the air like particles of hope. Lena was already drawing on the wooden floor with chalk, her bright, perfect yellow sun. Baron explored the corners, his purring a continuous low of contentment. Kale stood by the window, watching the quiet street below. Aisha approached him. I could never have done this without you," she said, her voice heavy with an emotion that made her tremble. Kale turned to her. The twilight caressed his face, softening his features. "You're mistaken, Aisha," he replied softly. You were already doing it. You were always fighting. I just opened a door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it. He extended his hand, and this time not to touch her, but in an open gesture, indicating the room, his new life. This is all yours. You earned it. Aisha looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, and, in an act of pure and simple courage of the heart, she placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, a junction of rough skin and scars, of stories of pain and survival. It wasn't a romantic handshake, but a promise. A pact. They were and would be a family. Forged not in blood, but in loss, in kindness, and in the deliberate choice not to walk alone in this difficult world. The touch lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Tomorrow, for the first time, was not a threat, but a seed they would water together. The new apartment wasn't a palace, but for Aisha, every square inch was a treasure. The sound of the crackling heater was a symphony. The hot water gushing from the shower was a miracle. The privacy of having her own room, of closing the door and knowing Lena was safe in the next room, was a freedom she had long forgotten. The stability brought with it a new quietude to her soul. She began sleeping through the night, nightmares receding into the shadows. Her work at the community center flourished. Her own experience made her incredibly effective. She could calm newcomers with a look, with a cup of tea brewed just as it was made at home, with a word whispered in their language. She became the unofficial bridge between the frightening new world and the displaced souls arriving in it. Kale was still present, but their dynamic had evolved. It was no longer protector and protected. They were partners. He dined with them almost every night, and those meals became the core of their shared life. The small kitchen filled with the aroma of spices Kale brought from the market, cardamom, saffron, cumin, and Aisha patiently taught him, with amusing delight, how to prepare dishes from their homeland. He was a clumsy but dedicated student, and his failed attempts filled the house with laughter. Lena was his biggest fan, sitting on the bleachers, supervising with Baron on her lap. One of those nights, while the scent of Kabili Palau filled the air, Kale was helping Lena with her homework. The girl was learning to read in the local language, and she stumbled over the words. It's not fair, she grumbled, frowning. It's too difficult. Kale knelt beside her. Your mother, he said softly, had to learn an entirely new language in a foreign country, alone, with a broken heart. And she succeeded. To give you a better future. A little reading? That's nothing for a warrior like you, daughter of a lioness. Lena looked at him, then at Aisha, who was stirring the pot, her eyes brimming with tears. The girl straightened her shoulders and returned to her book, a new determination on her face. That night, after Lena fell asleep, Aisha and Kale sat in the living room, the comfortable silence between them. She loves you, Aisha said, her voice soft. Kale smiled, a smile that now easily reached his eyes. The feeling is mutual. He paused, looking at his hands. Sometimes, I feel like I'm betraying my daughter's memory. By being so happy. Aisha felt a pang of pain for him. She understood that feeling, survivor's guilt. It's not betrayal, she said, choosing her words carefully. It's a tribute. Your daughter would have wanted you to be happy. My husband would have wanted the same for me. Happiness doesn't erase their memory. It gives them meaning. Kale looked at her, and the gratitude in his eyes mirrored her own. He didn't need to say anything. The language they shared no longer needed words all the time. It was the taste of shared bread, the sound of Lena's laughter, the tranquil weight of the silence in the warm room, the unspoken promise that, whatever they were, they would be together. Aisha realized in that moment that love wasn't just a whirlwind of passion. Sometimes it was a quiet thing. It was showing up. It was fixing a window. It was learning to cook a dish from a distant country to see a smile. It was the courage to build a new home on the ruins of two broken hearts. And in that quietude, surrounded by the echoes of her new life, Aisha knew, with a certainty that came from her bones, that she was, finally and completely loved. Spring arrived, bringing with it an explosion of color to the city's flowerbeds, and a new rhythm to Aisha's life. Her confidence, once a fragile plant, now had deep roots. She was promoted to integration coordinator at the community center, a role that allowed her to use her experience to shape policy and create programs that truly worked for refugee women. She spoke at meetings, her voice, once a whisper, now clear and firm. Her story, which had once shrunk her with shame, became her greatest strength, a tool for building bridges of empathy. One day, a new family arrived at the center. A Syrian woman, Sanaa, her eyes wide with shock and fear, and two small children clinging to her skirts. Her husband had disappeared during the crossing. She didn't speak a word of the local language. Aisha saw herself in her. The trembling hands, the defensive posture, the silent despair. While the other staff tried, unsuccessfully, to communicate with her, Aisha approached. She said nothing. She simply sat down beside Sanaa, picked up the kettle, and made 2 cups of strong, sweet mint tea, the kind they made in the desert. She placed a cup in front of Sanaa and sat in silence, sharing that space of fear. Sanaa looked at the cup, then at Aisha. A single tear rolled down her face. She took the cup with both hands, as if clinging to a life raft, and drank. It was the only invitation they needed. Aisha became her anchor, just as Kale had been hers. She helped her fill out forms, find temporary shelter, and enroll the children in school. She took her to her apartment for dinner, and Lena, sensing the sadness of her new friends, shared her toys and her cat Baron. Kale, seeing the scene, smiled. He saw the cycle complete. One afternoon, Aisha was helping Sanaa unpack her meager belongings in her new shelter room when she saw something familiar. Wrapped in a piece of velvet at the bottom of Sanaa's suitcase was a small Quran. And pinned to her cloak with a safety pin was a pendant. A hamsa. It wasn't hers, of course, but the resemblance was striking. "My grandmother," Sanaa whispered, following her gaze. "She told me she would protect me." Aisha felt a shiver. It wasn't the same chain, but it was the same faith. The same hope. The same ancestral belief that kindness and protection could be conveyed through objects, gestures, stories. She told Sanaa her own story. About the pendant she had given. About Kale. About the long journey from darkness to light. Sanaa listened, her eyes filling with a new emotion. Hope. "So, it's possible?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Is it possible to find the light here?" Aisha took her hand. Her own hand, once rough and trembling, was now firm and warm. "Yes," she said, and her voice was a promise. "It is possible. And you won't have to find it alone." That night at home, Aisha told Kale about Sanaa's pendant. He was silent for a moment, gazing at the flame of a candle. "The good we do is never lost, is it?" He finally said. "It's like a seed. It may take years to grow. It may travel across oceans. But one day it sprouts." He looked at her, and the love in his eyes was tangible, warm, and solid. "You planted a seed of kindness years ago, Aisha. And now, look at the forest that has grown around you." Aisha looked around. At her house. At her daughter sleeping in the next room. At the man who loved her. At the work that gave meaning to her struggle. And at the new friend to whom she could now reach out. She was living proof that a single act of pure, selfless kindness could unleash a current of light powerful enough to illuminate even the darkest of nights. And she could hardly wait to see what other seeds would sprout. Summer enveloped the city in a warm embrace, and Aisha's apartment breathed a life that extended far beyond its walls. It was the sound of Lena laughing in the park with Sanaa's new Syrian friends. It was the sound of Kale humming a song from his childhood while fixing the kitchen shelf. It was the sound of Baron chasing a ray of sunshine on the floor. It was the sound of Aisha talking on the phone, her voice calm and assertive, helping another family find their way. One Sunday, they had a picnic in the park. Sanaa and her children joined them, and the air filled with the smell of fresh bread, fruit, and the sweets that Aisha and Sanaa had prepared together. The children ran on the grass, their voices a joyful mix of languages, while the adults sat on a blanket, watching. Kale sat beside Aisha, his arm lightly touching hers. It was no longer an accident. It was a conscious touch, an affirmation of their place side by side. Sanaa smiled at them. "You are a very beautiful family," she said, and the words were not an intrusion, but a blessing. Aisha looked at Kale, and he looked at her. There was no need for a grand gesture, a dramatic declaration. The life they had built together was their declaration. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple, Lena ran to them, breathless and happy. "Mom! Uncle Kale! Look!" She opened her hand. There it was, a small, smooth white stone. "It's for you. For our home." Aisha took the stone, its surface still warm from the sun. It was a simple, silly thing, but to her it was more precious than any jewel. It represented permanence. Belonging. Home. Kale put his arm around Aisha's shoulders, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. She closed her eyes and simply listened. He heard the sound of his family. It wasn't a loud or triumphant sound. It was the gentle sound of peace. It was the whisper of the wind in the leaves, Sanaa's muffled laughter, Lena's quiet breathing as she fell asleep in her blanket, Baron's deep purring curled up at her feet. It was the sound of a pain that hadn't disappeared, but had been transformed, woven into the fabric of something strong and beautiful. She opened her eyes and looked at Kale's face, illuminated by the golden light of twilight. His eyes were no longer sad. They were full. Of peace. Of purpose. Of a love that had grown slowly, like a resilient vine, intertwining around their broken hearts and uniting them, making them stronger than they could ever have been alone. Aisha was no longer the woman who believed no one would notice her. She was a woman who had been seen, not just by a man, but by life. And in being seen, she had learned to see herself. As a survivor, a protector, a bridge builder, a mother, a friend, a beloved. She squeezed the stone in her hand and smiled. Her story wasn't about a perfect happy ending. It was about a new beginning. And each new day, with all its simple and ordinary sounds, was the most beautiful surprise she could imagine. Her kindness, once a small pendant given in desperation, had returned to her, not as an object, but as a whole life. And she knew with a certainty that warmed her inside, that her story was only the first chapter of many others that she would help to write, always with the same simple and transformative message: you are not alone.